1800s. Most people aren't even aware that in the original Constitution, senators were elected by state legislatures. Okay, they were not elected by the population. And the reason that happened was so that senators would not be involved in popular issues of the day and concentrate on protecting state rights. We already had the representatives to represent the people. You didn't need the senators to do that. The senators were supposed to represent the state legislatures, and also they were supposed to represent the middle class, the bankers, the merchants, the businessmen, okay? They're supposed to be elder and wise statesmen. You know, if you look back at the Constitution, the way the checks and balances work on the Constitution is that the states are supposed to be the check against the federal government, and the federal government is supposed to be the check against the states. Not the way it is now, like the population is trying to be the control on the federal government. It was never meant to work that way. The issue you have now is pretty clear. Because the states no longer represent or elect the senators, the state legislators no longer elect the senators, the states have no representation on the Hill with Congress, and as a result, this has allowed the federal government to just come in and obliterate the state and the state rights. The reason this particular amendment came about, it was right after the Civil War. Because of the Civil War, there was a loss in the faith of the states, and there was a lot of scandals involving state legislatures, and as a result of that, there was a popular movement to turn voting senators in over to the population. But as a result of that, it's left a big gap in our checks and balances in the Constitution, and it's also left senators at the mercy of the population and not doing the good of the states. So what is needed is a constitutional amendment that senators are again elected by state legislators, so we need a constitutional amendment to repeal Amendment 17. There has been no aspect of the Constitution distorted or manipulated more than that related to monies. And I'm talking about Article 1.8.5, which talks about the need to have metal-backed monies. There's absolutely no reference at all in the Constitution to the Federal Reserve. The problem is that the Constitution restricts Congress to gold and silver coins. Now, Congress expected banks to issue paper currency backed by metal. Obviously, you can't make large purchases carrying around the gold and silver coins, okay, because they're too heavy. But what inevitably happened is that the banks eventually issued paper money not backed by metal, and this completely added distortions to the economy. So in 1913, the federal government decided to get rid of all these banks out there generating notes. They put together a couple of private banks of their choosing, which came up with what we call today the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve issued notes that was redeemable by gold. And from there on, the government just went crazy in regards to money. In the 30s, they collected and manipulated the price of gold. In other words, it was illegal to hold gold. Any gold you had to turn into the government. The government took and upped the price of that gold artificially, and overnight debased everybody's money. They debased the coins. The coins are no longer now gold and silver. They even changed this scenario where the federal notes used to be redeemable in gold. That's not happening anymore. You can't get gold for your Federal Reserve notes. The erosion of the dollar has put the dollar about 5% of what it was in 1933. The Federal Reserve, again, these are not elected officials, they're not accounted for in the Constitution, yet they have absolutely incredible power. And what they do is, the problem with the Federal Reserve is they artificially manipulate money supply, generally for political reasons, and they are responsible for the booms and the busts that have happened over the last number of years, including the bust we're in right now. So, what is needed is a constitutional amendment saying no Federal Reserve, let the forces of capitalism handle the money supply. If there is some aspect of the Federal Reserve that is felt needed, that it be done by constitutional amendment, and no printing of monies unless backed by metal. Now, folks, I want to talk about my favorite recommendation for an amendment to the Constitution. And what we're talking about here, folks, is Article 3, which deals with the Supreme Court and its relationship and powers over other branches of government. The problem is this: the founders intended the Supreme Court to be a guardian of the Constitution. In other words, what they call a supremacy clause, where federal law and the Constitution was the supreme law of the land. However, there's nothing in the Constitution to what happens if the Supreme Court imposes its will contrary to the Constitution. As time went on, there was discussion over just what was the boundaries of the Supreme Court in regards to its interpretation of the Constitution. And in the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court actually put an end to that question because it gave themselves the right as to what was Constitution and what wasn't. In other words, the Constitution, according to them, is what the judges say it is. And folks, that just threw the floodgates wide open. Now they had room to base decisions on public policy and modern doctrines. They could interpret statutes by Congress that was different from the obvious intent of Congress. And they would use judicial review to distort original meaning of the Constitution, in effect creating new laws and using opinions to amend the Constitution. After the Constitution went into effect, shortly after that, Thomas Jefferson recognized the error. In other words, there was a loophole that was left in the original Constitution and suggested an amendment to the Constitution so that either Congress or state legislatures might have veto power or removal power over the Supreme Court. So what is needed is an amendment, a constitutional amendment, where Congress or state legislatures have veto power over the Supreme Court, particularly where they overstep their bounds in regards to interpretation of the Constitution and federal law. Now let's talk about Amendment 1. Okay, the First Amendment precludes the Supreme Court and federal government from any involvement in religion. The problem is this, folks: the founders felt formal education must include religion, morality, and knowledge. Okay, we're talking about formal education related to religion, just the basics of all religion, okay? And they also believed in separation of church and state and not religion and state. And for many, many years after the Constitution went into effect, the court confirmed the wall between